Good afternoon. Here to introduce our keynote speaker is Monica Del Villar, a 3L here at Howard University School of Law.
Good afternoon. Hello. As you said, my name is Mo Del Villar. I am a third-year student here at Howard University School of Law. I am pleased to be with everyone today to celebrate the great Pauli Murray and to have this opportunity to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Patricia Bell-Scott. Dr. Bell-Scott is an award-winning author, a scholarly journal founder, and a professor emerita of women's studies and human development and family science at the University of Georgia. She is the former contributing editor at Miss Magazine and the co-founder of the National Women's Studies Association. A graduate of the University of Tennessee, she began her teaching endeavors in the early 1970s at the inception of the women's studies discipline. Through her long career, she has always uplifted the issues of women, and specifically African American women. Dr. Bell-Scott is the author of The Firebrand and the First Lady. Excuse me. The book explores the fascinating relationship forged between HUSL's very own Pauli Murray and the First Lady of the United States, Eleanor Roosevelt. We are taken through a pre-civil rights, pre-Brown versus Board of Education, pre-women in universities and law schools, so pre-Title IX, and a World War II America through the words of Pauli and Mrs. R. We get to view the complexities of the nation's problems through the 1930s and 1960s, through the eyes of women from two very different stations in life. Now, if you don't know, Pauli Murray's picture is hanging up with the class of 1944, one floor up to the left, in Houston Hall, across the hallway from the office of Dean Koontz Robinson. I've always looked at that picture and wondered, black woman, LGBT with or without the label, a devout believer and a law student in 1944. What could that have possibly been like? Dr. Bell-Scott allows Pauli to speak for herself and tells us exactly what it felt like to face the racial discrimination that almost kept her from her undergraduate degree at Hunter College, only to then face gender discrimination after graduating first in her class and the only woman here from HUSL and being denied admission at Harvard Law, as was the tradition at the time. The 2 decades of work that Dr. Bell-Scott spent going through the letters between these women and the journals, diaries, poems, and essays of Pauli Murray is apparent as she artfully uses these sources to allow Pauli to explain exactly why the term Jane Crow was, and I would argue still is, necessary. Pauli Murray is the kind of lawyer we should all strive to be, and serves as a reminder that no matter your starting point or obstacles in life, as a HUSL lawyer, you can either be a parasite or a social engineer. Dr. Bell-Scott's book introduces many of us to the true character and strength of one of our giants upon whose shoulders we must now stand. And I hope this program will inspire many of us to stand now, just as Pauli did when she was a student here at HUSL. Dr. Bell's address will include a Q&A portion and will be followed by lunch and a book signing of her book, The Firebrand and the First Lady, A Portrait of Friendship, in the Moot Court foyer, just beyond the doors behind you there. And with that, I ask you to please join me in welcoming Dr. Patricia Bell-Scott.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I want to begin with thanks to the visionary leadership of the Howard University School of Law, led by Dean Danielle Holly Walker and Associate Dean Lisa Grooms Robinson. I also feel I would be remiss if I didn't say something about the support that Ms. Shalonda Colbert has given for this conference. I don't know if she's in the room, but please let her know that we gave her a moment of honor. The conference that they've organized is historic. for it pays homage to and considers the legacy of its trailblazing alumna, the Reverend Dr. Pauli Murray. I also want to thank Dean Yolanda Pierce for her opening remarks. That Dean Pierce is the first female dean in the 150-year history of the Howard University Divinity School would please Pauli Murray. For she was nurtured by professors in the Divinity School during her law school tenure. I also want to thank my husband, Charles Vernon Underwood, my high school classmate, Dr. Wyndon Ringer, colleagues and friends who are here from afar and near. And I also want to take a moment to publicly thank several current and former staff members of the Moreland Spingarn Research Center here at Howard. Without them, the firebrand and the First Lady would not have been possible. You have a tremendous resource here at the center, and the people who I want to call out are Dr. Janet Sims Wood, formerly Assistant Chief Librarian for the Reference Department, Ms. Joanne Ellen Bershear, Head of Manuscripts, Dr. Clifford Muse, Head of Howard University Archives, and Ms. Nesta Barnard of Alumni Affairs, all of whom helped me locate documents and people who broadened my understanding of Murray and the Howard experience. The historian Susan Ware was correct when she wrote in the summer 2002 issue of the Journal of Women's History that when historians look back on the 20th century, all roads will lead to Pauli Murray. Whether the issue was labor, civil, or women's rights, Pauli Murray was there. Since her death in 1985, interest in her life and contributions have mushroomed. This year has been a banner year for Pauli Murray. And you've heard mention of some of these events, but I want to mention them again just to tell you what's happened in these first 9 months. January marked the 40th anniversary of her ordination at the National Cathedral here in DC as the first African-American female Episcopal priest. In March, the Schlesinger Library at Harvard University, which houses the Pauli Murray Papers collection, hosted a symposium entitled Rediscovering Pauli Murray. In April, we celebrated the 30th anniversary of the publication of her prize-winning autobiography, Sung in a Weary Throat. And I'm pleased to let you know that a new edition will be reissued and come out in the spring of 2018. Also in April, the Pauli Murray Project of the Duke University Human Rights Center hosted a celebration for the unveiling of the National Park Service plaque marking the designation of Pauli Murray's childhood home as a National Historic Landmark. Some of you probably read in April the New Yorker article entitled The Many Lives of Pauli Murray, which introduced her to a wider audience. In May, a third biography about Murray was published by Rosalind Rosenberg, and that biography is entitled Jane Crow. Also in May, Pauli Murray's contributions to the law were honored at the Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg Lecture on Women and the Law at the New York City Bar Association. Also in May, Howard University awarded Murray an honorary doctorate at the spring commencement, and her niece, Karen Ross, who heads the Pauli Murray Foundation, accepted the award. Also in May, the Brooklyn Youth Chorus in New York performed several works by the composer Jeff Beal, who was inspired by the story of Pauli Murray's friendship with Eleanor Roosevelt. And they're in the process of developing a longer symphonic piece based on my book. In August, the Pauli Murray College, which is the first residential college at Yale, opened, and it is the first college named in honor of an African-American, a woman, and someone identified as LGBTQ. And just before coming here, I received word that the African American Intellectual History Society has announced that it has established the Pauli Murray Book Prize for the best book in African American intellectual history. In short, Pauli Murray continues to make waves, and I'm sure there's more to come. Now, my purpose this afternoon is threefold. I want to consider how Pauli Murray's early life and her experiences here at Howard contributed to her worldview and activism. I also want to highlight a few of her contributions as a lawyer. And I also want to offer some thoughts about what we can learn from her life. Born on November 20th, 1910 in Baltimore, Maryland, Anna Pauline Murray was the fourth of 6 children born to William Henry Murray, a teacher educated in the college preparatory department of Howard University, and Agnes Georgiana Fitzgerald, a nurse trained at the Hampton Institute. 2 tragedies marked Pauli Murray's childhood. The first was the death of her 7 months pregnant mother of a cerebral hemorrhage when Murray was only 3. And the second tragedy was the murder of her father, William, at the hands of a white guard in the Crownsville, Maryland hospital for the Negro insane when William was an inmate. Unlike her siblings who remained in Baltimore with her father's relatives, Murray went to live with her mother's family in Durham. And it is that experience of being reared by racially proud elderly kin who were church-going school teachers which nurtured her compassion for the vulnerable, her intellectual curiosity, her love of African American literature and poetry, and her devotion to the Episcopal Church. It was evident early on that Murray was an independent spirit who preferred working alone as opposed to in groups. Almost always ahead of the curve in her thinking, she was impatient with convention and bureaucracies, and usually smarter than those with whom she had to work. She was willing to challenge inequality and authority figures head on, even if they happened to be the President and First Lady of the United States. Perhaps the first sign that she was headed toward the law as a profession came when she filed her first complaint against discrimination over the breakfast table. She was barely 6 years old when she asked her Aunt Pauline, "How come you give grandfather 3 pancakes and me only 1?" And she never stopped asking hard questions, no matter how brash or inappropriate they sounded to others. Murray loved language, philosophy, and debate, even though she was innately shy and at her best and most comfortable expressing herself on the page. She was a nonconformist in her personal and professional life. She was woman-loving, and she refused to accept conventional or cultural definitions of who she was. She challenged the barriers that restricted the entry of African Americans and women into the law and the priesthood, commonly reserved for whites and males. Murray's deepest yearning was to be a writer. However, the demands of life as an African American living in the South repeatedly called her into social action, and that activism would eventually draw her into the practice of law. As a child in North Carolina, the law required her to attend segregated schools. Legally defenseless, she fought segregation with her conscience. It was the only weapon she had. Rather than to ride a segregated bus, she walked or bicycled wherever she went. She refused to go to theaters that seated blacks in the peanut gallery. She enrolled at Hunter College in 1928, graduated 5 years later at the peak of the Depression, and joined the ranks of the unemployed. She was saved from homelessness by the WPA and a brief respite at Camp Terra, which was a residential facility for unemployed women in the Bear Mountain area of upstate New York. It was there that Murray crossed paths with Eleanor Roosevelt for the first time, and the seeds for a decades-long friendship were planted. In her 20s, Murray had 3 significant encounters with NAACP lawyers, many of whom were graduates or professors at Howard University School of Law. The first of these involved the University of North Carolina Graduate School, which denied her admission to the sociology department in 1938 on racial grounds. In addition to sending protest letters about the university's whites-only admissions policy to Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt, to the administration at the university, she also sent these materials to the NAACP Secretary, Walter White, and its counsel, Thurgood Marshall, who was a Howard University law man. Murray hoped that the association would take her case. They did consider it, but decided not to, for reasons that were never quite clear to her. It might have been her politics, for she was surely to the left of the NAACP leadership. It could have been her temperament, as she was a self-described individualist with a first-class intellect, and her assertiveness bothered the association's largely male veteran leaders. Or the problem could have been Murray's family history, for her father, who had been incarcerated and murdered in a mental institution, would not have been viewed as a desirable plaintiff for a test case. It is also possible that NAACP lawyers backed away because they were suspicious about Murray's personal life, her boyish physique, her bobbed hair, her preference for slacks over dresses, her close relationships with women, and her ambiguous first name would have been cause for concern. The second encounter Murray had occurred in 1940, 15 years before the Rosa Parks bus event in Montgomery, Alabama, when Murray and a friend were arrested and jailed in Petersburg, Virginia, charged with disorderly conduct, creating a public disturbance, and violating a state statute that mandated racially segregated seating on public buses. The judge fined them $5 plus court costs. This time, the NAACP agreed to handle the appeal. Their case seemed to be an ideal tool to test the constitutionality of the state ordinance requiring segregated seating. Murray and Mack came to Howard to prepare for the appeal with a circle of elite civil rights attorneys at the Howard Law School. This group, known as the Brain Trust, included Thurgood Marshall, with whom Murray had previously consulted on the University of North Carolina application, William Hastie, who was the first black federal judge and at that time dean of the Howard Law School, and Leon Ransom, professor of criminal law here. It was a formidable team, and Murray found the debate during the practice session mesmerizing. Nonetheless, they would lose the appeal when the prosecution dropped the violation of segregation charge to avert a constitutional challenge. The third incident that brought Pauli Murray into close contact with Howard University before she enrolled as a student involved the case of a 23-year-old African-American sharecropper from Gretna, Virginia, who shot his landlord and employer, Oscar Davis, a 44-year-old white tenant farmer, on July 15, 1940. Waller admitted that he shot Davis, but that he had shot in self-defense. Waller was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death by an all-white jury of men who had paid the poll tax. It was a case fraught with problems, as Murray, who ran the national campaign to save Odell Waller's life, quickly learned. There was the questionable credibility of the prosecution's only eyewitness. There was the problem of judicial temperament, as the judge, the 66-year-old white presiding judge, displayed a dismissive attitude toward the defense. There was suppression of evidence indicating that Oscar Davis had a violent temper, regularly carried a gun, and used it. But perhaps the most consequential error was that of Waller's initial attorney, who did not document the jurors and Waller's poll tax status. This, Murray believed, would have been proof that Waller had not been tried by a jury of his peers. Because this error was foundational to Waller's first-degree murder conviction, Murray felt that he was executed because of a technicality. After Pauli Murray's experience with the University of North Carolina and her inability to enroll in school there, her arrest in Virginia after she refused to move to the black section of a public bus, and the execution of Odell Waller in what she believed to be the self-defense shooting of his white lawyer, she made 3 commitments that she would keep for the rest of her life: to acquire the intellectual and technical tools needed to challenge institutional discrimination based on race, class, and gender, to utilize her passion for writing in the service of her activism, and to oppose the death penalty. Murray had several connections to Howard before she arrived on campus in the fall of 1941. As previously mentioned, her father, William, had graduated from the college preparatory department. She'd already met the dean of the law school, William Hastie. She'd met Professor Leon Ramson, who recruited her to come to school, and Thurgood Marshall actually wrote a letter of recommendation for her application for admission. Murray's affection for the school was also colored by the fact that her older brother, William Jr., had been a law school classmate of Thurgood Marshall's before financial and emotional difficulties forced him to withdraw. When Pauli Murray set foot on the campus, there were no women on the faculty at the law school. She was one of 2 women enrolled in her class, and she was the only woman to complete the first year. Having been reared by family elders who placed no restrictions on women and who expected them to be self-reliant, and having graduated from a women's college and worked under women supervisors in the WPA, Murray had little awareness of sex bias, but her consciousness was awakened the first week of her first semester when one of her professors announced to the class that he really didn't know why women came to the law school, but that since they had come, the men would have to put up with them. She was deeply hurt when Professor Leon Ransom, whom she adored, told her that she could not attend a smoker, which was a gathering at his home for first-year male students, sponsored by the campus chapter of a legal fraternity. Murray could not understand how Ransom, who regularly risked his life fighting for civil rights, could exclude her. That he made light of women's exclusion when she approached him about the issue moved her to think of civil rights as an issue that went beyond race and class. In a letter to the fraternity's president, Murray raised the question of equal opportunity for women. She mentioned that there were only 59 black women attorneys in the U.S. in 1941. Given this small number, she argued, it is ill-advised to use the same policies of exclusion in membership which are applied against us by the majority group. The fraternity refused to revise its membership policy, and Murray responded by outperforming her peers in class. She had entered law school preoccupied with the racial struggle and single-mindedly bent upon becoming a civil rights attorney, but she would graduate an unabashed feminist and take on sex discrimination, or Jane Crow, as she called it, as well. Murray coupled her excellence in the classroom with activism in the community. She co-led the Howard University student chapter of the NAACP's discrimination boycott against segregated eateries in DC. She penned opinion pieces for several news outlets and represented the U.S. at the International Student Assembly. She graduated in 1944 with the expectation of attending graduate school at Harvard Law, as previous top students from Howard had done. But her application was rejected, this time not because of race, as was the case with the University of North Carolina, but because of sex. She made a gallant appeal to Harvard to change its decision. Eleanor Roosevelt pushed Franklin Roosevelt, who was a Harvard man, to write the president, and he did. However, it was all to no avail. Harvard would not admit women law students until 1950, and the first African-American woman would not be admitted until 1953. Undaunted, Murray would earn the Master of Law from the UC Law School at Berkeley in 1945, the Doctorate of Law from Yale in 1965. And she would garner several important appointments. She would briefly be Deputy Attorney General in the Department of Justice for the state of California. She would be a staff attorney with the American Jewish Congress. She was an associate attorney with Paul, Weiss, Rifkiff, Wharton, and Garrison, senior lecturer and specialist in constitutional and administrative law at the University of Ghana, a consulting attorney with the Equal Employment Opportunities Commission, and the Stolberg Professor at Brandeis University. She maintained a private practice for nearly a decade. However, the two positions that she most coveted, which were not an option for her, those two positions were a seat on the Supreme Court, and she wanted to be on the law school faculty at Yale. In looking back at Murray's contributions, the list is long and our time is short, but I would be remiss if I didn't at least underscore what has come out already in presentations about Murray's importance to the Brown decision. When Pauli Murray read the NAACP brief used in the Brown case, she knew that the argument had a familiar ring to a paper that she had written a decade earlier in a civil rights seminar at Howard. She was astonished to learn in a casual conversation with Spottswood Robinson, a former professor who had been a member of Thurgood Marshall's team, that NAACP lawyers had used her essay. And that essay is entitled, "Should the Civil Rights Cases in Plessy v. Ferguson be Overruled?" Murray had argued in that essay that segregated schooling placed black children in an inferior social and legal position. Finding no legal precedents to rely on, she had drawn upon the research in the field of psychology to demonstrate that segregation did violence to the personality of the individual affected, whether he or she was white or black. It was an argument that had evoked derisive laughter from her classmates 10 years earlier, but it moved Chief Justice Earl Warren, who wrote the unanimous opinion in the Brown decision. Murray's contributions to women's equality are reflected in the influential law review article she authored with respect to sex discrimination in employment and education. The first of these was her master's thesis entitled "The Right to Equal Opportunity in Employment," published in the California Law Review in 1945. It marked several milestones. It was her first law review essay. It was the first law review essay published in a law review by an African-American woman, and it was the first law review essay on sex discrimination and employment. She wrote several monographs on civil and women's rights, which would have lasting value. For example, the monograph entitled "A Proposal to Re-examine the Applicability of the 14th Amendment to States' Laws and Practices which Discriminate on the Basis of Sex per Se" was a comprehensive analysis of judicial decisions on cases involving legal distinctions based on sex. In this monograph, Murray urged the pursuit of litigation under the 14th Amendment as a practical intermediate step, yet she did not dismiss the need for an equal rights amendment. And this is a strategy that would blossom under the able leadership of the Women's Rights Project, headed by the future Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who credits Pauli Murray as an intellectual mentor. Murray would also write another document that helped to ensure that sex remained a protected category in the 1964 Civil Rights Act, when Senate Majority Leader Dirksen threatened to amend it by eliminating sex as a category. Of no less important, and also mentioned, was the role that Murray played in co-authoring with Dorothy Kenyon the ACLU brief White v. Crook, a civil class action suit challenging an Alabama statute restricting jury service to males and whites. This was the first case in which a federal court relied on the 14th Amendment to rule a state law unconstitutional because of sex discrimination. So what can we say about Pauline's life? What have we learned? What can we take away? Pauli Murray was a lawyer, an activist, a scholar, a poet, a priest, rolled into one. Now, we do not have to be as multi-talented, but we do need to be mindful of the fact that it takes lawyers, activists, artists, intellectuals, religious and political leaders to advance the cause of human rights. Thus, as we go about our work, it is important that we seek the input of those working for social justice in other arenas. I think her life teaches us that the voice and participation of those who come from the most vulnerable backgrounds are essential to the dialogue. Young people who have not learned to self-censor often offer a mind-shifting viewpoint. Think again of the 6-year-old Pauli Murray asking about the distribution of food over the breakfast table. I think her life, her personal motto in particular, bears repeating, and that was, don't get mad, get smart. She channeled her anger and frustration in useful ways. When she was blocked, she'd take a step back to reassess the situation, self-reflect, and she was, as I am, a compulsive journal. So you talk to yourself on the page. She did a lot of that, as her papers collection demonstrates. She would plan, she would reemerge, and she would re-engage. I think her life also teaches us that it is important to speak out, even if you are a solo voice. Murray used to say that one person plus a typewriter constitutes a movement. Had she lived into the digital age, I think that she would say that one person and a smartphone certainly constitutes several movements, an army. I think her life teaches us that it is important to engage in, be willing to engage in, find the courage and the perseverance to engage in difficult dialogues. Her nearly 3-decade-long friendship with Eleanor Roosevelt, I think, is testimony to the way in which a friendship in which difficult dialogue is one of the commitment, demonstrates how much you can grow in the context of friendship. I think her life also demonstrates how important it is to have support and to give support. One of the things that I think we have to be careful of, because Pauli is such an incredible person, and we see her tackling all kinds, what appear to would be for many of us mountains, is we have to remember that she needed more support than she had. So it's really important that we support each other and give those who we see struggling to mount those huge mountains get support from us. I think that her life teaches us that mentoring, however we can best do that, keeps the pipeline flowing. Murray shared her training manuals from the Howard University student demonstrations with the bus riders in the 1950s. And these materials would be used over and over again in the 1960 student sit-ins. I dare say, I think there are remnants, I see remnants of it in the Black Lives Movement. Certainly the social media aspect of it. So she regularly shared what she had learned with those who were coming behind her. I wouldn't be here now probably, and certainly would not have written the firebrand in the First Lady if she hadn't jacked me up with a letter. It was an encouraging letter, but it was a letter that essentially said, you need to be doing this, when she really didn't know me well enough to say that to me. But that never mattered to her. That was not fair. So she regularly sent encouraging letters to the next generation. She nurtured organizations. We know she was the co-founder of NOW. She nurtured civil rights groups. She nurtured groups of attorneys. I think her life also teaches us to choose our tools for the circumstances. For example, in her youth, Murray sought to work out intolerable frustrations through poetry. And as she became more involved in the civil rights, early civil rights movement of the 1940s, she turned to law as a means of working within the system for social change. And as she saw crisis deepen along racial lines, she felt that the law by itself was inadequate to cope with fundamental moral and ethical issues, and this led her to turn to theology. I think her life teaches us that we need broad experiences to enrich our work and understanding of the human condition. Pauli Murray had a passion for poetry, and she felt it necessary for her work as a lawyer and priest. She once told a reporter who was interviewing her about her legal career that her goal had been to integrate the poetic impulse with the precision of legal analysis. I would love to have seen the expression on his face when she said that. As a lawyer, she said to Eleanor Roosevelt in a letter, there are times when a legal brief is inadequate to make the point. As a lawyer, she said, she was bound by the facts, but as a poet, her job was to respect the truth. I think her life teaches that compassion must be at the core of our mission. She said that without compassion, our good works are meaningless. I'd like to close with a quote from one of her sermons, one of my favorite sermons, which I think speaks to the centrality of hope in her worldview. She said, our actions have lasting significance and consequences that are felt throughout eternity. Therefore, we need not despair because we seem to fail or cannot see the fruition of our efforts on behalf of others. If we build with love and compassion, we can build with hope. May we be inspired by the example of the Reverend Dr. Pauli Murray. May we be imbued with her passion, and may her spirit guide us ever onward. Thank you. Questions?
There are two mics, right there and over there, if you'd like to ask a question.
How you doing?
Hi.
Thank you for your book.
You're welcome.
In your research and writing, did you see where the life of Pauli Murray intersected in any way with that of alumna Cooper, who was at the law school during that time period?
Pauli Cooper was a registrar and is believed to be the first woman to have taught courses at the law school at Howard. I did not see any correspondence between them, but Pauli Cooper was at the law school when Pauli came, but she was not teaching. There's some question about when she actually when she taught the first course, because she taught without pay and without recognition. But she was a graduate of the law school too, and I think she hasn't been dead. I don't know when she died, but it hadn't been that long. But Pauli was aware of her, but she was not on the faculty. She was not teaching on the faculty, as far as we know, when Pauli came. Because if you see the photograph of Pauli out there in the hallway, you will see the professors, and all the professors were men by the time she got here. But Pauli May was here in the 30s. Thank you for bringing her name into this moment. Yes. Mm-hmm.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about Pauli Murray's letter to you and what you have learned from her about mentorship as someone who, subsequent generations, now you're someone who we look to and admire, what you've learned about passing on that energy to future generations.
Well, I guess what I'd like to say is the letter before the letter that was the catalyst was one to me and two co-editors who were working on, we had worked on a textbook in women's studies. It was called All the Women Are White, All the Blacks Are Men, but Some of Us Are Brave. And Newsweek magazine had done a feature on women's studies around the country, and they had not included any of the work being done on black women, wherever that work was being done. And they had totally ignored historically black colleges because there were courses there. And we sent a letter to Newsweek, which they published, basically calling them to task. And Pauli Murray, as was her habit, was following these developments. So we get, to our surprise, a letter from Pauli encouraging us, and she essentially says, I can't remember it exactly, but something to the effect, here's an old timer who appreciates your work. It can be done. I know that was one. It can be done. And keep moving forward. So it was a really encouraging letter, which gave me the courage a little bit later to write her and ask her if she would serve on the board of this journal that I was developing. And she quickly wrote me back, and I had enclosed a postcard for her to return to say yes or no. She returned the card and said yes. And then a couple of days later, I get this letter. And if you've gotten or seen any of her correspondence, you know she seemed to live in front of a typewriter. So it's in this teeny, it must be Times Romaine, but it seems like really tiny type, very tight. And when you get 2 pages from her, every space is covered. And, so she starts out by asking us, do you know how serious this is? Do you know what you're doing? This is really important. This could really impact the academy. This starts, by this time I'm scrunching in my chair, reading this. And then she also says to me, I'm sorry that I'm not going to be able to contribute to the inaugural issue because I'm trying to finish this, and these are her words, dratted autobiography. She says, so this was this was 18 months before she died. I had no idea she was ill. I had no idea that there wouldn't be time, but she said, don't bother me, I've got to finish this. After, she says, I need another 12 months to get this done, and then, we can talk about what I might contribute. And so I said, fine. I said, I'll just keep a note of the things that I want to talk to you about. But also in this letter was a line that said, you need to know the veterans on whose shoulders you stand. That also made me do like this because I felt like she was pointing her finger in my face, which she was, and telling me what I needed to do. And she mentioned her work with Eleanor Roosevelt. And this is in 83. And see, it's not until the autobiography comes out 2 years after her death in 87 that I realize how central this friendship is. So anyway, she dies. I'm devastated, And the autobiography comes out in 87. I read it and I see there are essentially 2 chapters on Eleanor Roosevelt. And I'm busy working on the journal Sage, doing other things. It's 7 years and I keep thinking, it's like I keep hearing, you need to know the veterans on whose shoulders you stand. So I'm some of you have heard this story, but I'm at Schlesinger Library, which has her papers, and I'm working on another project. And I decide, because I'm there, that when I want to take a break, I'll just request the first set of folders of the correspondence between Pauli Murray and Eleanor Roosevelt, and I'll just look at it. And they brought it to me, and I opened it up, and I read the first 2 letters. I got up, I went to the bathroom, I stood out in the little foyer area, I took a sip of water. I was very disturbed, and I went back inside, and I sat down in front of that folder, looked at it again, looked at the set of notes that I was making on the other project. I simply closed it. And I said, okay, I see what I'm supposed to do. 20 years later, here I am. So it was, you know, people, I've had particularly young writers say to me, how did you choose it? Because they felt like, oh, the timing was perfect. I mean, you know, this is a perfect time. I didn't, you know, she chose me. Yeah, you know, people will say, you know, how did you work that out? You know, Yale named the college. There's the historic landmark, and all these things are happening. I said, you know, I didn't, you know. So she had a way of reaching out to people through words. Barbara talked about how Pauli used words. She had a way of reaching out of touching people, and it was as if there were two sentences in those letters that wouldn't let me go until I looked at that folder, and then I just had to shut down everything else. Oh, and then there's another interesting part to this, and that is, after I started working on the biography, I sort of was not sure if I just needed to focus exclusively on Pauli or if it should be about the friendship. But I decided that there was something about this friendship that was important enough for Pauli to mention it to me. And I think what I've tried to communicate is the importance of it being a context for growth, but also the fact that, as we've talked about all of the issues Pauli faced, it was a place where she found acceptance for who she was. And about 7 years after I was into writing this book, had chosen to focus on the friendship, I came across a letter to Caroline Ware, who was a friend that she made here at Howard, who had been a faculty member, in which Pauli said, I'm making notes for my future biographer. And this letter is dated 1971. In 1971, I knew about Pauli, but I was still in graduate school. And so she says, I'm making notes for my future biographer. I'm not sure if that person will want to start the biography after Proud Shoes ends, because that covers her childhood, or if they will want to start with the UNC case and my subsequent friendship with Eleanor Roosevelt, which I was already doing. And then, you know, I trembled when I read that. And I didn't read that until I was into the book for 7 years. So. Yes.
Did Dr. Murray ever receive any recognition for her work that was seminal to Brown versus Board of Education? And also, can you talk a little bit about the name of the book, Firebrand and First Lady?
Okay. That's a loaded question. I'm still bothered by the fact that I really want the NAACP to acknowledge her more. I really wish that she had gotten the Moorland Spingarn Award. Now, I know the policy, I know that the policy is they don't give it posthumously. But it really bothers me. And I really would like to see them do more. I do know that I do see her mentioned more on the website and in public, in some publicity, but no, she never got that credit, which is why every chance I get, I mention it. And the title of the book comes from, the firebrand comes from Eleanor Roosevelt, who, in a statement that she made in an article that she said this in an article she wrote, interestingly enough, for Ebony magazine, in which she said, you know, one of my finest young Negro friends is a young firebrand lawyer, Pauli Murray, of whom she's done some foolish things in the past, but of whom I'm very proud. And she says, and she's matured. So Eleanor felt that in those early years that Pauli was a real firebrand, and that was her way of describing it. And Pauli sort of adopted that, you know, yeah, I'm a firebrand. And she would say, yeah, I've done some few foolish things, some of which I'm ashamed of and some of which I'm not.
question.
Yes.
Thanks for your work. I'm a HUSL grad, and so it was here that I learned about Pauli Murray and had the opportunity to go down to Duke and all that stuff. So my question, though, is about Pauli's audacity, in a way. And what I mean about that is, reading your book and reading so much about her, she always took it upon herself to write a letter to someone, to somehow feel that she had the ability to impact policy or the direction of a struggle in a way that I think many of us feel powerless given this political climate. And even though we have the use of social media, I guess my question is, what do you think we can take from Pauli in terms of how we find a way to fuel our contribution and to change almost the direction of society? Like, what do you think her lesson is for us, based on your research?
Well, I would say one of the first things, several things. One of the first things would be to start with what your strengths are. So if you are a writer, use that. If you are a person who has good organizational skills, use that. If you are a person who is really good at providing support to others, use that. So identify what strengths you have and how they might be used in the service of activism or the cause. I also, going back to that quote I concluded with, I think it's really important to keep in mind something she said about hope, which is, we may not always know whether or not our efforts will pay off. In fact, as she grew older, she would make comments about how her lost causes would be found. You know, my lost causes were found. They were causes, she really thought that it just wouldn't happen. But she had faith and kept at it. So I think that one of the things that social media is great, and I think it really helps us spread the word and helps us feel connected. But there is also an element of it that encourages us, and I'm looking at all these bright young faces in the audience, encourage us to have this need for immediate gratification. And sometimes when we're looking at social change, more often than not, we have to think about the long run. So what it means is we might not get the reaction, we may not get the change we want right now. But our goal and what we need to do is to take the tiny or the first step where we may move beyond that, but we may not. What might happen is the person who comes behind us will be able to step on our step and move forward. So I think this notion of taking the long view, and I also believe that her commitment to intellectual growth and development is really important. And I also think in the midst of this, learning to, and I've learned this from studying her life, how important it is to do self-care. It wasn't always possible for her to do the kind of self-care that would really have helped her even more. I take that away from her life. But we are able in many instances to do that. So providing support to others, but also doing the necessary self-care. So we don't always have to think of big things, these small, gradual steps that move us and the people with us and those who are to come behind us forward. I think we need to think about.
Thank you for your inspirational lecture, and I'm so eager to read your book. I was thinking about Carol Adams' work, Eyes Off the Prize, and her critique of Eleanor Roosevelt and kind of deconstructing her as this heroine of civil rights and human rights. And in particular, I believe it was when Roosevelt was on the NAACP board and chairing the Human Rights Commission, and yet she declines to act on the NAACP petition. So I'm interested in what Murray's reaction might have been to that, and whether there were kind of broader tensions in the friendship in terms of disappointment Murray might have had with these missed opportunities for Roosevelt to stand in solidarity.
Eleanor Roosevelt was a pragmatic politician, and that made for some tensions with her and Pauli. They had tensions many times over issues of how to handle civil rights questions. Keep in mind, this friendship starts in the 1930s, and in one of the first exchanges between them, this I think captures the tension between them. Eleanor Roosevelt writes back to Pauli, who has written Franklin and Eleanor about the situation in North Carolina and how she wants to go to the University of North Carolina. And she's saying to Franklin, you know, if you think it's such a great place and if it's a model of liberalism, you need to do what's necessary to help me enroll. Eleanor writes back, you know, I understand, I'm paraphrasing, I understand the situation and the difficulties, but you must be patient. Pauli Murray is not in a mood to be patient. And so a lot of the tension in the early days of the friendship have to do with Eleanor saying, you need to be patient. Eleanor's belief is you work within the system. Pauli's view is the system is messed up. We need to change the system. So there are tensions around that. There are tensions as I'm trying to think of some good examples. Oh, I think of in the 1956 presidential campaign when Eleanor supporting Adlai Stevenson. And the black leaders want him to speak out against segregation. They want him to endorse the Brown decision, and they want him to be outraged about what has happened to Emmett Till. Stevenson's trying to waddle the line because he doesn't want to lose the Southern Democrats. Pauli writes a hot letter to him and Eleanor about this situation. And, you know, at various times she says there can be no compromise on the issue of justice. And so over time, what you see is Eleanor Roosevelt, who begins this friendship with Pauli, I would say slightly right of center, and Pauli, who begins far, far left, moving toward each other, so that Eleanor, who initially tells Pauli, as long as these segregation laws in the South exist, like you're supposed to sit at the back of the bus, it does no good to violate them. Our goal is to get them changed. Pauli's saying, no, the law is unjust. I'm gonna violate it, you know, which gets her in jail. By the time Eleanor dies, she's violating the law. In 1962, I would argue that this friendship has pulled her a little slight of center, so that she is meeting in places like the Highlander Center in Tennessee with black student activists. And this is also against the law. They're having interracial meetings. There she is breaking the law, having these meetings and doing workshops with them, preparing other students to be prepared to engage in sit-ins which break the law. So there are tensions, but what I see is I see them growing with each other. Pauline never moves to the center, but she moves closer. She gets to the point where she's no longer someone who's voting for the Socialist Party. She's a registered Democrat, but she will only vote for you if she thinks you're righteous. Eleanor has gotten to the point where there's some laws that she's breaking. And I think it's the influence of Pauli as well as some other young black radicals like Harry Belafonte, like Bayard Rustin.
Yes, I had a quick question about her relationship with Bayard Rustin. I know they were both marginalized. He was the architect of the March on Washington, and they were both marginalized during that, not being able to speak because of their orientation and gender. What kind of relationship did they have going forward after that?
It started out as a very warm one, and I would say it remained cordial, but it blew up over the March on Washington because the program was structured in such a way that up until the women just said they wouldn't tolerate it, there were to be no women on the program. And then after the march, Pauli made a statement that was published in the Washington Post about the treatment of women. And she was just outraged because the only scheduled speaker was, the only woman who was scheduled to be on the program was Mahalia Jackson. And when the women raised that question and they were told, well, Mahalia's on the platform, Pauli and Dorothy Height said, well, but she's singing, she's not speaking. And so Pauli resigned from the board of the, I've forgotten the name of the center he was head of. So they had real tensions, and there's a real hot letter when she said to him once, when are you going to recognize that human rights is indivisible? Why don't you step down off your pedestal and be a brother? Is what she says in this. I quote it in the book. I mean, so it gets hot. Because what she's saying, which is what some of the other speakers have said, Pauli always says, take me in my wholeness. You know, take me in my wholeness. I insist on being my authentic self. So don't say I can only talk about race, or don't say, because she had issues with now, don't say, we can only focus on gender. Take me and other women in our wholeness. So what that means is she's always challenging everybody. You can imagine this is not always easy for people, because it's probably easier in terms of bureaucracy and the politics to have a movement that's more narrowly defined as opposed to one that's more inclusive. At least that's the thinking of some people. Shalonda.
Okay, good. Well, thank you so much.
Pauli Murray's legacy of passionate American patriotism is both gift and roadmap to all who seek justice in an imperfect world. Knowing that one's origin story and lived experiences form part of a larger, more intricate tapestry, Pauli Murray was compelled to document how she negotiated many identities of being: woman, Black, transgender. We are able to glean much about justice and equality from Pauli Murray because of her body of work. It's proof from first-hand account, the author of the manual for the struggle against all forms of discrimination. Having no manual herself is not to say she was without mentors, role models, and muses. It is merely the recognition that the trifecta of exclusion that resulted from being born Black, woman, and transgendered just a few generations removed from the great American stain of slavery proved to be a uniquely intimate experience with inhumanity that many of her contemporaries could not have imagined, let alone withstood. What Pauli Murray contributed to America was her commitment to the quest for her own enlightenment and the enlightenment of others, while chronicling her experiences in the struggle for justice, inclusion, and dignity for all members of society, especially those who have been othered by race, by gender, by status as laborer or worker, soldier, children, poor, the deprived, the infirm. Pauli Murray's journey is significant because of her first-person articulation of how gender influences the lived experience of someone from a certain race, and how race impacts the lived experience of someone identifying with a certain sex. In so doing, she authored the seminal manual, especially for women of color, on how to survive, aspire, thrive in a country scarred by its history with slavery and ravaged by Jim Crow's voracious rampage on black bodies and minds. As well, she gave voice to all women, but especially black women who labored under what she herself identified as Jane Crow. As an African American woman, a proud alumna of Howard Law, lawyer, dean, mother, spouse, and leader, with over 27 years of active and reserve service to an America I have sworn to defend, Pauli Murray's Manual on Justice has taught me to use my industry, gumption, and grit to be self-determined, yes, but to also acknowledge the strong bonds that an American collective can forge when universal equality is prominently featured as a core value. Grit, that combination of passion, perseverance, and persistence. In Pauli Murray's case, it was a recipe for mind mapping the strategy for achieving our democracy's binding core value, equal protection. What is remarkable about Pauli Murray and her path is that every step of her journey toward this goal, and in turn her own self-actualization, seemed unceasingly haunted by her own insecurities. From losing her parents early in her childhood to experiencing chronic poverty, Pauli Murray's orbit would seem to predict failure. Two things stand out about this pioneering woman that made failure not an option. First, she believed fervently that education paved the way for achieving universal equality. Second, she drew a line in the sand between fascism and democracy. No matter what obstacles were presented by her internal struggles with self-determination, Pauli Murray never doubted for one moment that the rule of law in a democracy means that every person is entitled to equal protection under the laws, and that citizens have fundamental rights, rights so deeply rooted that neither liberty nor justice would exist if they were sacrificed. Pauli Murray used all of her passion, perseverance, and persistence to wage both small and large battles in defense of universal equality. Her battle theaters included the classroom, the lunch counter, the transportation network, the courtroom, the print media, personal correspondence, the scholarly journal, and in church. Pauli Murray demonstrated that rights are not given. Rather, rights are demanded. And in demanding, through nonviolent protest and organized resistance, one woman can liberate a nation. What does Pauli Murray teach us about justice and equality in the 21st century? Pauli Murray teaches us that justice and equality are context dependent an observation that highlights one of the most significant features of the 14th Amendment to the United States Constitution. This point also illuminates a salient lesson from Pauli Murray's life. Achieving self-determination through myriad forms of expression to comprehend one's own unique voice, identity, and experiences in this world while simultaneously drawing on these sources of knowing and being is the formula of a vibrant democracy. Stated another way, expressions of the self-determined identity as opposed to the mere performance of identity will unlock the yet unknown and thus untested facets of the 14th Amendment. Pauli Murray used her life and her experiences as a lens to view the power and the promise of a more just and more equal society. Her achievements demonstrate that grit and active commitment to full inclusion will guarantee humanity's triumph over inhumanity in this new century. Thank you.
The ties that bind, what Pauli Murray teaches us about race, family, slavery, and inequality. Pauli Murray is an unsung American hero. She was a civil rights activist, a feminist, a lawyer, a book author, a poet, a professor, and a priest. She was a trailblazer, the first Black person to earn a doctorate in law from Yale University, one of the co-founders of the National Organization of Women, and the first African-American female ordained Episcopal priest. Pauli Murray was downright revolutionary. She was sitting in the front of the bus before Rosa Parks and sitting in at the lunch counter 15 years before the Greensboro Four. She wrote the Bible of the Civil Rights Movement, a 1950s book entitled States' Laws on Race and Color. She coined the term Jane Crow in a 1965 Law Review article to describe the similarities between the legal discrimination of Blacks and women. Her legal analysis was used in the first Supreme Court case that held that the 14th Amendment Equal Protection Clause supported the prohibition of differential treatment based on sex. I came to know about Pauli Murray because I'm a professor of family law, and my research is centered on the intersection of legal frameworks that connect race, gender, and families. I'm in the process of writing a family law casebook along with two prominent Black female law professors. Our casebook will be grounded in the concept that race is foundational to our understanding of family law. Slavery laws and the use of race as a social construct have been integral to the development of family laws in our country. It is important to us as authors to make sure that, or to claim the strong influence of race on the legal treatment of family formation, family regulation, and family dissolution. We are excited to be the first Black female authors of a family law casebook because it will allow us the opportunity to include cases and interdisciplinary reading on how race impacts family identity and how the legal determination about who has rights and obligations within the family was not only centered on gender, but race as well. It will also allow us to tell law students of all colors, nationalities, ethnicities, genders, and sexual orientations about Pauli Murray and her family and what she did to advance the universal cause of equality. Race and family have been inextricably intertwined since America was founded, and the law has played a critical role in the intersection of the two concepts in our society. The law has also played a calculated role in separating the races as families from an ideological perspective. In other words, the social construct of race and the inferiority and superiority complexes that accompany it serve to allow for legal exclusion of family members within family units. There were two separate legal systems that govern white families and Black families, common law for whites and slavery law for Blacks. Because slaves were treated as extra legal outside of the law, there was a divide that continued beyond emancipation that still haunts us today. Often the family law casebooks present a myth of the American family prototype as white, heterosexual, married couple with children, when in actuality, families have always been more complex in composition and identity than the presentation of the ideal. The truth is that the concepts of race and family are similar. They are fluid and complex. Pauli Murray's family experiences illustrate this truth. They show the many ways that the foothold of structural racism began with placing insurmountable legal barriers between Black men, women, and children as a family unit. Pauli's family history is emblematic of the struggle of racial justice and equality in America. The pain and tenacity of her ancestors shaped her destiny as well as spurred her activism. Ultimately, her story is about the ties that bind us as families in America. There are many instances in Pauli's family history where people passed for white. One of the first instances was her Aunt Pauline, who was married to a Black lawyer who was a graduate of Howard Law, who could not find work in his profession because of his race. A white lawyer told him that he might become more successful if he crossed over the color line to practice law as a white man. He decided to do so and asked his wife to join him. Well, Aunt Pauline was having none of it. She was very proud of her history as a Fitzgerald and very proud of her race. So they divorced over that issue of race. There was a relative who used to take Pauli shopping when she was younger, and she would leave Pauli outside of the store because Pauli looked Black, but her relative looked white. And she would do this so that she could get better service in the stores based on the impression that she was white. Well, when Aunt Pauline found out about this, she was hot, and she forbid Pauli from ever going with that relative anywhere. A more personal story for Pauli came when she moved in with her cousin Maud in New York. Cousin Maud and her family passed for white in their neighborhood in Queens, New York, which was made up of various immigrants from Germany, Ireland, Italy, Poland, and Armenia. While the neighbors assumed that cousin Maud's family was white, when Pauli came to live with them for a year in order to go to Hunter College, she felt like the stranger who had upset the balance in the relationship with the neighbors. She also said that cousin Maud made her feel ashamed about her color. In contrast to what Aunt Pauline taught her about having pride in her race and setting an example in racial achievement, cousin Maud's choice of passing for Pauli meant that they settled for an anonymous life with self-imposed mediocrity. While she acknowledged that it was a life without bitter struggle, she also saw that it was a life without the incentive to excel. When Pauli was growing up, she heard many stories about the Smiths and the Fitzgeralds. The Fitzgeralds were her paternal side of the family and were very proud that they were free Negroes. She learned later in life that, in fact, her great-grandfather, Thomas Fitzgerald, had been a slave as a child and young adult, but he was freed when he was 24 years old. He was inherited by a Quaker family at the age of 11, and the Quaker faith did not believe in the institution of slavery. He was listed as a free Negro in the US Census and was educated by his owner. He grew up knowing that he was property, but unable to assert any independence. Her grandfather, Robert Fitzgerald, who was a school teacher, was born a free Negro. He had fought with the Union during the Civil War and later established schools for Negro children during the Reconstruction era. Robert was married to Cornelia Smith, who was born a slave in North Carolina. Her mother, who was Pauli's great-grandmother, Harriet, was the personal slave of Mary Ruffin Smith. Mary's father was Dr. James S. Smith, a very distinguished citizen of North Carolina, whose family had owned a number of slaves. He was a Democratic congressman and a trustee at the University of North Carolina for many years. He had 3 children, Francis, Sidney, and Mary Ruffin. His family had donated a good deal of land to UNC, and Mary's brothers, Francis and Sidney, both graduated from college there. Francis became a doctor, while Sidney went on to become a lawyer and aspiring politician. Well, when they returned home from school, they both set their eyes on Harriet. They admired her from afar, like many of the people in the county. She was known to be one of the most beautiful girls, white or Black. She was thought to be 3/4 white and 1/4 Cherokee Indian. Back in those days, Indian women were often kidnapped, listed as mulattoes, and forced into slavery as concubines or breeders. In fact, Dr. Smith had paid a high price for her at the time, $450, because the children brought high prices in the slave market. Well, Harriet expressed a desire to marry when she was 20 years old, and her choice was Reuben Day, a freeborn mulatto. Dr. Smith gave his permission mostly because it was good business. He did not really care about free Negroes, quite the opposite. He had helped to change the state constitution in North Carolina in 1835 to take away their vote and bar them from education. Dr. Smith knew that slavery law provided that the status of children was determined by the status of the mother. All of Harriet's children would be slaves, no matter the legal status of the father. So they married but could not live together because of their different status. They had one son together who never really knew his parents. Harriet could not really care for him because of her duties to Mary, and Reuben was eventually run off by Frances and Sidney. 2 years into their marriage, Sidney and Frances's desires to have Harriet culminated in them physically attacking her husband. One evening, as he was leaving a visit with Harriet on the Smith property, Sidney questioned why he was there. Reuben reminded him that he was Harriet's husband and that Sidney's father had in fact consented to their union. Well, Sidney proclaimed that slave law ruled over the preacher's words. Reuben was told, "Somebody's been fooling you, boy. Don't you know slave marriages aren't recognized in this state?" And with that, he and his brother beat him severely and dismissed him as a trespasser on the land. He was told he would be shot on sight if he ever set foot again on the Smith lot. Reuben Day disappeared from the county, leaving his wife and son behind, never to be heard of again. Well, what did this mean for Harriet? No Negro man would marry or defend her because he knew it would possibly end in his death. She was a marked woman, destined to become the subject of not one but two white men, as she had no control over her body or even the children that came from it. She used to nail her door shut and put up barricades so that no one could get to her while she was asleep. But to no avail, Sidney broke down the barricade and nailed the door shut to keep her inside. And even though she struggled and screamed, Sidney raped her with no interference from anyone and continued to beat and rape her over and over again until Frances put a stop to it. There was a huge fight between the brothers this time that ended in Sidney being found unconscious, bleeding with a hole in his head. After this, Sidney did leave her alone, but Frances eventually took his place with nightly visits. It was not known whether Harriet was resigned to this reality or whether she was grateful for the attention. Cornelia said that her mother was devoted to Frances, though there was never any public or legal recognition of their relationship. Neither Frances nor Sidney ever married or left their home. Either way, in that situation, Harriet really had no personal choice as a slave. She gave birth to 4 girls, Cornelia, who was Sidney's daughter, and Pauline's grandmother. The other 3 children were Emma, Anna, and Laura, the daughters of Frances. Cornelia instilled in Pauline the pride of her father's family history, that she had good blood and should hold her head high as a descendant of doctors, lawyers, judges, and legislators. She considered herself an aristocrat, not a slave. This was mostly because she was raised in the big house by Mary Smith. Mary had no children of her own because she had never married. While Mary was mortified by what had happened, she realized that these children were Smiths, in fact, her nieces. While there was much gossip about what had happened between the brothers and the fact that these 4 mulatto girls were living in their home, she essentially became their mother. While the girls were aware that Harriet was their biological parent, they looked to Mary because she made all the choices for them. The Smith family was caught between a rock and a hard place, incapable of treating the girls as servants purely, but unable to openly recognize them as kin. However, Sidney Smith did claim Cornelia as his daughter and often bragged about her intelligence. They had a very close relationship, and he instilled in her a rebellion against everything Negro slavery embodied. The dichotomy of Sidney was that he still owned slaves, and he represented slave owners in suits to maintain their property. Ironically, he also often did pro bono work, successfully defending slaves in court who had been accused of crimes, winning their freedom. He drank a lot, perhaps to cover the hatred he felt about slavery and maybe even about himself, since he was perpetuating the very evil he secretly deplored. Well, Mary didn't want the girls to be sold as slaves, so she eventually worked in her garden to earn the money to purchase both Harriet and all her daughters. Even though she told them they were free after she bought them, she never manumitted them outright. And she carefully withheld education from them, training them in only housework and sewing. When Mary died, she left Cornelia and her 3 sisters 100 acres of farmland. Pauli's grandmother used that land to earn money to educate her 6 children and her numerous grandchildren. Cornelia retold the haunting story repeatedly to Pauli, and in her book, Proud Shoes, Pauli says the recounting was a long-buried wrong which had refused to die, and that her grandmother expected her to right it somehow. In the fall of 1938, Pauli had her chance. She applied to the graduate school at the University of North Carolina, not fully realizing how much her courageous act would propel her forward to become what some called a one-woman civil rights movement. Her application came shortly after the U.S. Supreme Court decision in Missouri ex rel. Gaines versus Canada, a case that ruled that the state of Missouri had to provide a black student, Lloyd Gaines, with facilities for legal education equal to those provided for white students, or it must admit him to the University of Missouri School of Law. While Pauli was completely unaware of this case, she became embroiled in this segregation debate when she was denied entry to the UNC graduate school explicitly because of her race. Pauli Murray understood the impact of her skin color and her family connection in a keen way. Her denial reminded her that not only was this unequal treatment about race, it was about white unacceptance of her family identity. Her efforts to attend UNC Chapel Hill, a university that her family had endowed, teach us about the disinheritance of race. Pauli later stated that the real victory of that encounter with the Jim Crow system of the South was the liberation of her mind from years of enslavement. She eventually did receive a degree from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. In 1978, she was awarded an honorary degree. She felt it was more than an academic honor, stating, "It was a symbol of acceptance stretching back to her grandmother Cornelia and her relationship to the Chapel Hill Smiths." However, at the time she was scheduled to receive the degree, there was an ongoing dispute between the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare and UNC regarding its compliance with a federal court order to enforce desegregation. The department threatened to cut off federal funds to the university for failure to produce and implement an acceptable plan for dismantling the legacy of segregation. So Pauli withdrew her early acceptance of the degree. So what does Pauli and her family teach us about race, family, slavery, and inequality? Pauli's family shows us that race and family are fluid and complex. Pauli teaches us that family ties and the function of families often define and transcend racial differences among people. She also demonstrated that although family ancestry can be painful and shameful, it is a powerful motivator to fight on the battlefield of equal rights and the strive for true freedom. Understanding the history of family law is accepting the construction of race and the power dynamic of families within race relations. Slavery was contingent on laws regulating blacks as inferior. The only way the U.S. could configure a system to support slavery was to flip family law on its head. Pauli wrote about this in her autobiography, stating, "Few white people in the South wanted to acknowledge blood ties between the races created by the slave-owning class during slavery. If we are truly to accept how families came to be physically formed in America and the government's role in the denial of black family life and growth, we would have a better understanding of the true arc of justice." Thank you.
I want to just start by thanking Dean Holly Walker, Professor Crooms Robinson, Shalonda Colbert, and all who made this symposium possible. I start with a quote from Pauli Murray in 1970. Racism and sexism in the United States are so deeply intertwined in the country's institutions that the successful outcome of the struggle against racism will depend in large part upon the simultaneous elimination of all discrimination upon sex. I start with this quote because it is not only a very accurate diagnosis of two intersecting oppressions, but it is also a call to action, and one that could not be more needed in the country we are now living in. The action that it calls for is a kind of coalition work, but not just the typical, I'll work on your cause and you work on my cause kind of coalition work. Reverend Murray's call to action states that my cause is your cause, so we need to work together. Post-2016 election, there are many, many my cause is your cause examples. I'm going to focus on just one, discriminatory harassment in school. I will talk about a couple of cases related to that are examples of discriminatory harassment, and then suggest a particular call to action that is created by this harassment. So my first pair of cases starts immediately after the election, when all black freshmen at the University of Pennsylvania received messages, email messages, containing a daily lynching calendar that featured their names. This was followed 6 months later by the fatal stabbing of a black Bowie State University student on the University of Maryland campus by a University of Maryland student who was the member of a white supremacist Facebook site. The stabbing was preceded by several racial incidents at the University of Maryland, including a noose discovered in a fraternity and white supremacist flyers that were posted on campus. And many black students at the University of Maryland were unhappy with the university's response to these incidents. In the second pair of cases, both pre-2016, a so-called rape guide was posted on a Dartmouth online message board targeting a first-year woman student. The college failed to take any steps to identify the person who had posted the message, and the woman student later reported that she was in fact assaulted at the first party that she attended after the posting was posted. The next year at University of Mary Washington, a feminist student organization leader was murdered by a fellow student after organization members were repeatedly threatened and harassed over a social media app called Yik Yak. And the university, they had pleaded with the university to do something about this harassment, but the university did not respond. So each of these cases should cause all of us serious concern just on their own. Together, however, they suggest a pattern that is even more worrisome because it fits Reverend Murray's deeply intertwined analysis. The pattern is one where racial harassment in schools seems to be following a path already established by gender-based harassment cases, where discriminatory verbal harassment escalates, sometimes very quickly, into physical violence. Even without the escalation into violence, but certainly with that escalation present, student victims are going to end up feeling very traumatized and fearful, and student bystanders, even the bystanders to this violence, are likely to share at least the fear as well as other psychological stresses. None of this provides a good educational environment or an equal educational environment. Studies show that students who feel more vulnerable and unsafe have a harder time getting what they are there to get out of their education. As one researcher explained in the case of hostile racial climates, if you're going to be afraid in school, you're not even going to raise your hand in class. And research on campus gender-based violence corroborates this insight, because many victims of at least severe sexual harassment, like sexual assault, cannot go to class at all, at least in the immediate aftermath of the violence. But that immediate aftermath can last for months. So these experiences of fear, trauma, and vulnerability create the unequal educational opportunity and the hostile environments that civil rights statutes are concerned about. Which brings me to Dr. Murray's call to action. In 1965, Dr. Murray advised women to look to the fight against race discrimination for models to dismantle gender discrimination. Today, at this moment, and on this issue, we need to consider this advice in both directions. So in one direction, campuses can look to what has been done to combat sexual harassment for models for how to combat racial and ethnic harassment. And in particular, schools should be addressing the trauma and fear that result from racial and other discriminatory harassment, same as schools have learned to do in the case of sexual harassment. And this is especially true when the harassment escalates to the severity of physical violence. Schools should also consider expanding their bystander education programs, which up until now have mainly been used in gender-based violence prevention programs. So programs like the Obama administration's It's On Us encourage bystanders to intervene in safe ways to prevent violence or to lessen trauma to victims of violence after the violence has occurred. And such programs could easily be expanded to include racial harassment, anti-immigrant harassment, religious harassment, all of which are potential expansions that would be very needed at this moment in time. So for those of us who are looking to, who would like schools to do this, but schools aren't doing it, and we would like to compel schools to take these kinds of steps, we could look to models developed by the Obama administration's Office for Civil Rights. These are methods that were developed to enforce Title IX, the groundbreaking anti-sex discrimination in education statute. And during the Obama administration, OCR improved its enforcement in such a way so as to push schools to start improving their prevention and responses to sexual harassment. Much of what the Obama administration did could also work for racial and ethnic and other discriminatory harassment. Okay, but in the other direction, we also need to defend Title IX, which is currently under attack from several different sources. That attack, if successful, will have negative implications for protecting all students from all forms of discriminatory harassment. The most serious attack on Title IX right now is coming from the new administration, which announced last week that it plans to start a process that risks dismantling settled agency guidelines that date back to the Clinton administration. The particular target of the Trump administration is a Dear Colleague letter that was issued in 2011, where OCR clarified that it expects schools to use a preponderance of the evidence standard of proof in investigating complaints of sexual violence. The preponderance of the evidence standard of proof is the appropriate standard of proof for civil rights matters. And OCR has expected schools to use that standard consistently since the 1990s and in both sexual harassment and in investigations of racial harassment. So rejecting the preponderance of the evidence standard would constitute what I've characterized as a criminalization of Title IX, because it would replace civil rights standards with standards that are commonly used in the criminal law. And such a criminalization is a threat to all of civil rights law, because criminal law and procedure are not designed to protect equality. Using a criminal approach has been shown over and over again to undermine equal treatment. So there are at least half a dozen reasons, legal reasons, why criminalization damages civil rights protection, but they're too numerous for me to talk about them today. However, we can see criminalization's damaging effect in another way, because its potential damage is obvious from who is pushing it. In addition to the Trump administration, many other opponents of the preponderance standard have a consistently anti-civil rights agenda. So indeed, all indications are that this is just the first attack or the first attempt to weaken civil rights protections against discriminatory harassment and violence generally. If the push to criminalize standards for one form of discriminatory harassment is successful, you'd better believe that anti-civil rights forces will then seek to criminalize other forms of discriminatory harassment and weaken the protections against racial harassment as well as sexual harassment. To give a concrete example, in 2015, a group of white fraternity brothers made national news when they were recorded singing a song that celebrated lynching and used racial slurs. The university expelled the two students who played a leadership role in that incident. And the only organized objections to those expulsions came from the same organization that has led the attack on Title IX and the preponderance standard. The organization defended the videotaped racist conduct, which had spread throughout the campus and beyond the campus via social media. They defended it as not creating a hostile environment of any kind, but merely as free speech. So, I take it off just because I don't want that slide up for very long. So another tactic of the anti-preponderance groups confirms in the negative the wisdom of Dr. Murray's deeply intertwined analysis. It does so because it dresses up the attack on the preponderance standard as anti-racism. This narrative states that white college women have consensual sex with black college men, regret that sex because of racism-induced shame, and then accuse the men of rape, hearkening back to the age of lynching. Those advancing this narrative give no empirical support for it. And various legal scholars have noted the intersectionally racist and sexist stereotypes that it relies upon, both in terms of black women and in terms of black men. And in fact, it is virtually impossible to collect demographic information about student victims and accused students on college campuses. So empirical support for which racial groups are involved in sexual harassment complaints on college campuses is non-existent. But if we look to non-empirical sources, millennial college students are well known for their openness to crossing racial and gender boundaries in their personal lives. This generation is more open than any previous generation to crossing those boundaries. Therefore, the argument that race would cause a false accusation of rape among a wide swath of today's college students is extra implausible. More importantly, When viewed through the lens of Reverend Murray's analysis, the anti-civil rights push of this tactic becomes clear. It is not only damaging to the movement against sexism, it is damaging to the movement against racism. So turning first to the damage to anti-sexism efforts, the white women falsely accused black men narrative inaccurately suggests that white women are the only ones who complain about sexual harassment. In fact, many studies suggest that women of color experience more sexual harassment than white women, experience more severe sexual harassment than white women, or both. In addition, the criminal justice system has proven much less protective for women victims of color than for white women victims. I mean, in fact, the criminal justice system is famous for this disproportionately less protection that they offer to women victims of color. Therefore, reducing the civil rights protections against sexual harassment and violence may render women of color more vulnerable to sex discrimination than white women. Regarding the damage to anti-racism efforts, if successfully attacking protections such as the preponderance standard allows anti-civil rights forces to lessen protections against racial harassment, the civil rights of all people of color will be affected negatively. However, because women of color experience both sexual and racial harassment, we have the most to lose, not only from a successful attack on Title IX, but also from that success emboldening anti-civil rights forces to weaken protections for racial harassment. So, given the leadership of women of color in the anti-racism, anti-sexism, and many other civil rights movements, which Reverend Murray could not be a better example of that premise, and we have many current examples of that premise as well, women of color's losses will quickly translate into losses for civil rights generally. At the very least, if more women of color experience trauma due to fewer protections against harassment and violence, we will be less able to do pro-civil rights work because we will be busy trying to recover from trauma. Therefore, regardless of whether we are primarily focused on eliminating racism, sexism, or some other ism, we should still support the use of the preponderance standard as a critical part of our general civil rights scheme. Even if we think, which I admit I often do, that there's something a little odd about a civil rights struggle centered around an evidentiary standard. Even if we think that, I think we still need to heed Reverend Murray's call for a My Cause is Your Cause coalition on this issue. And I and about over 100 at this point law professors across the country have begun heeding that call in the case of the preponderance standard. So I invite any of you who are interested in more information on that and interested in joining the cause to contact me or come and talk to me, and I thank you.
Thank you so much to Dean Conway, to Professor Weaver, to Professor Canalupo. Now I have the pleasure, as I told you, this is Howard's sesquicentennial, our 150th. This is an event for the sesquicentennial and also the university's Constitution Day. So it is my pleasure to introduce the 17th president of Howard University, the husband of Simone Frederick, and the father of Kiri and Wayne, Dr. Wayne Frederick.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I want to thank the Dean for that appropriate and warm welcome. I was looking at the schedule and I realized I was invading a safe space here. So I do appreciate the fact that the all-woman panel, appropriately so, allowed me to have a little interruption. So I assure you that I'm here on behalf of my 11-year-old daughter, Kiri, whose middle school schedule wouldn't allow her to be here, so she sent some remarks via me for this purpose. We certainly are here to celebrate the life and legacy of Dr. Pauli Murray, and I've had an opportunity to meet her family and get to know her through a process that led to me awarding her posthumously an honorary degree. I'd like to extend my greetings to her friends and family in particular, but I would also like to thank the distinguished panelists and presenters for joining us today, and certainly still to come, Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. I don't think I need to use this now, okay? A few things that I wanted to mention. Dr. Murray was obviously a 1944 graduate of the Howard University School of Law and a true trailblazer. And as I was coming over here and walking into the law school, I got a call from another law school alum, Mr. Vernon Jordan. And this has turned into an almost daily conversation that I've been having with him about a myriad of things, all Howard and beyond, as you can imagine. It so happened that today, the reason he called me is because he was sitting in his office with the granddaughter of Charles Hamilton Houston, who is an L1 student here at the law school. And I mentioned that because the first time Mr. Jordan called me about this young woman, he wanted me to violate every single law as it pertains to admissions, because he felt that the only place that Charles Hamilton Houston's relatives should go to law school should be here at Howard. And I tried to explain to him that the young lady has options and she should exercise them. Nevertheless, as persuasive as he is, he certainly persuaded her to apply and to engage with us. I mention that because people like Mr. Jordan have not only been influenced by the Thurgood Marshalls and the Charles Hamilton Houstons, but he also was very much influenced by the life of Pauli Murray, and he is one of the people that I discussed awarding her an honorary degree. Of all the honorary degrees that I've awarded in my 4 years as president of Howard University, this is the only honorary degree recipient who was not nominated by someone. I make that note because a lot of the nominations, as you can imagine, come with some type of bias. However, this was the first unanimous vote on any one that I presented to the Board of Trustees to accept for an honorary degree recipient. The breadth of her work, the fields that she had touched were absolutely remarkable. I often wondered how many lives she lived in the short period of time that she lived because of the number of things that she did. I was an altar boy in an Anglican church in Trinidad before coming to the US. And when I read about her becoming the first African-American woman in the priesthood after everything else that she had done, I have to stop telling people that I was an altar boy, because that seems like not even a comma in her extensive autobiography. Pauli Murray embodies the Howard University motto of truth and service. She spoke truth to power by championing the rights of African Americans and women. She spoke her own truth by claiming her identity. She also lived her life in service to others through her work as a priest. And I mention that because I think we're living in a time in this country where that is probably more important than at any other time. There are people who will disagree with us. There are people who will disagree with the fact that we have a right to be free. But we must not lose the opportunity to engage them, regardless of what the expectation of our outcome of that engagement is. And yes, we must go to the table with that outcome of engagement at the highest level and highest expectation. But we must not shun away from that engagement because we have a diminished opinion or view of what that ultimate outcome may be. And too often today we're seeing that. We are living in echo chambers in a way that Dr. Murray didn't. When she disagreed, she made sure that she voiced her disagreement. She wanted a seat at the table, not to partake in fruit and food that wasn't well prepared, but she wanted a seat at the table so she could complain about the taste of the fruit and the food at the table. And I think we all should embrace that possibility and that opportunity to be at the table, not for the sake of eating and making merriment, but to be at the table to have stern conversation and discussion, and to willingly take up our plate and empty that meal into the garbage bin where it belongs, if that is where we believe it belongs. But we cannot do that and register our disappointment if we're not at the table. As I mentioned, this year we gave an honorary degree to her, but I thought it was also very important for Howard University, as we were celebrating our 150th anniversary, to only award honorary degrees to Black women, which we did for the first time in our history as a university. And I don't think that that would have been a signature event if she was not included. And including her was certainly one of the highest honors that this university has experienced, because our opportunity to honor her was really an opportunity for us to honor our best. So we here at Howard will certainly continue to lift up her legacy and promote her work as a blueprint for our students of today and tomorrow. And I want to also congratulate the law school and Dean Holly Walker for putting on this exercise. It is too often that we also do not recognize our heroes and that we do not celebrate our heroes. And I want to thank you for the opportunity to allow me to represent my daughter, because tonight, the bedtime story that she will hear about will be about Dr. Pauli Murray. And this will be a repeat, because the night before graduation, I read to her about the 4 women who we were giving honorary degrees to the next day, and she, because she did not have the opportunity to be in the room at the dinner the night before. My daughter said something to me about 3 years ago. She's 11 now, so she said this to me when she was 8. She came home one day and said, "I do not like working in groups with men, with boys, I should say." And I looked at her and I said, "Why?" And she said, "Because they take control, they mess things up, and then we take control and fix it." And she said, while that's an unnecessary step in getting to perfection, it is more aggravating because they never acknowledge that they were wrong. So I still hope and pray that the signature accomplishment of my presidency would be to pass on my office to the first female president of Howard University. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Shayla Soriano. I'm a 2L here at Howard University School of Law. I'm also the president of the American Constitution Society, and I'm here to introduce Justice Ginsburg. So today we are privileged to be able to sit at the feet of and learn from one of today's living legends, and a true champion for equality for all. Associate Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg spent a lifetime flourishing in the face of adversity before her appointment to the United States Supreme Court in 1993. While she was a law student, she was an attendant wife and mother to her late husband Martin and her daughter Jane. It might seem hard to believe, but upon graduating at the top of her class from Columbia School of Law in 1959, Justice Ginsburg had difficulties finding post-law school employment. It wasn't until a favorite Columbia professor explicitly refused to recommend any other graduates to United States District Judge Edmund Palmieri, who ultimately hired Justice Ginsburg as a clerk for a 2-year term. After her clerkship, she was offered some jobs at law firms, but always at a much lower salary than her male counterparts. Then in 1963, Justice Ginsburg transitioned from private practice into academia, teaching at Rutgers University School of Law, until 1972 when she returned to her alma mater as a professor. Doing what we know to be quite natural of her, she was a pioneer for future female academics as the first woman to be awarded tenure at Columbia. While at Columbia, she was also the director of the Women's Rights Project at the American Civil Liberties Union. In this position, she fought against gender discrimination, successfully arguing 6 landmark cases before the United States Supreme Court. However, while we know Justice Ginsburg as a paragon for women's rights, she drew much inspiration from our esteemed alumna, Pauli Murray. As we have heard today, Pauli Murray was indeed a trailblazer. In 1944, her final law school paper argued that segregation violated the 13th and 14th Amendments of the United States Constitution. In 1950, her treatise, States' Laws on Race and Color, was used to successfully argue many desegregation cases, including Brown v. Board of Education. Most notably, in 1965, Pauli Murray co-authored Jane Crow and the Law, Sex Discrimination in Title VII, positing that a law distinguishing on the basis of sex was a violation of the 14th Amendment. This same article would go on to ultimately inspire then Attorney Ginsburg in her Supreme Court appellate brief in the matter of Reed v. Reed. That case marks the first time that the High Court struck down a gender classification as a violation of the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. As an ode, Justice Ginsburg named Pauli Murray and Dorothy Kenyon as co-authors to acknowledge that her work carried on the work that Murray and Kenyon pioneered. When asked about this case, Justice Ginsburg is quoted as saying, "We are standing on their shoulders. We're saying the same things they said, but now, at last, society is ready to listen." After a trailblazing career as an appellate litigator, President Bill Clinton appointed Justice Ginsburg to the Supreme Court in 1993. Her career as a justice picked up where she left off as an advocate, fighting for women's rights. Her style in advocating from the bench matches her style from her time at the ACLU. Slow but steady, measured and calculated. So without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, I present to you a vanguard of freedom, Associate Justice Ginsburg.
It's a pleasure to be here to speak about a woman I admired and loved. Well, you've just heard that in 1965, an article appeared in the George Washington Law Review titled "Jane Crow and the Law." It was co-authored by Pauli Murray, then a senior fellow at Yale Law School, and Mary Eastwood, a lawyer at the Justice Department's Office of Legal Counsel. The article underscored that the U.S. Supreme Court had never found a distinction on the basis of sex violative of the 14th Amendment Equal Protection Clause. It was okay, the court had held, to bar women from certain occupations, lawyering and bartending, to pick two examples, and to keep them off jury rolls. But the genius of the U.S. Constitution, Murray and Eastwood believed, as I do, is its capacity through judicial interpretation for growth and adaptation to changing conditions and human values. As examples of judicial interpretation in tune with an evolving society, Murray and Eastwood noted Supreme Court decisions outlawing state-enforced segregation in public schools, establishing the one-person, one-vote principle, and declaring the right of indigent defendants in criminal cases to counsel appointed and paid by the state. The court could similarly recognize women's rights as part of human rights, Murray and Eastwood urged. The climate of the era, they said, was favorable for the court to move in that direction. And that is an important point. The court, it has been said, should never be influenced by the weather of the day, but inevitably it will be influenced by the climate of the era. Jane Crow and the Law was a blueprint for the gender equality legislation and litigation of the 1970s, in which I had the great good fortune to participate. Pauli Murray was on the board of the American Civil Liberties Union in the 1970s and a member of the union's Equality Committee. In 1971, as you have also just heard, when the ACLU briefed the turning point decision on the equal citizenship stature of men and women, read, I placed Paulie's name and Dorothy Kenyon's on the brief. Though Paulie was not then on the brief writing team because she had turned her attention from the law to the ministry, her identification of Jane Crow laws and her roadmap for ending them propelled our efforts. As your keynote speaker today, Patricia Bell Scott, recounts in her great work about Paulie's friendship with Eleanor Roosevelt, the firebrand and the First Lady, Paulie was a woman well ahead of the times in which she lived in many respects. Among illustrations, she led Howard students in successfully opening restaurants in the university's vicinity to people without regard to color, long before the sit-ins of the 1960s. She was in the vanguard of opening the ministry of her church to women. People of the same sex, she knew from her own experience, could be loving partners in life. Paulie was instrumental in persuading the ACLU to place gender equality on its human rights agenda and in launching the ACLU's Women's Rights Project. How blessed I was to have known her since my law student days, when I first read her family history, Proud Shoes. She was my senior colleague in the effort to promote justice, equal and accessible to all. It is heartening that at long last she is gaining the recognition as the multi-talented, brave pioneer she was. Thank you.